Hi, I'm Dan Heber. This is the lecture video to accompany the reading assignments on Descartes. And this is the second time we've encountered Descartes, but the first time we encountered him, we were emphasizing his epistemology, which is sort of mentioning some of his metaphysical views in passing. This is going to focus on his metaphysical views, specifically what Descartes has to say about the philosophy of mind. So, the reading assignment, the reading assignment begins here in section 3.4. I'm going to scroll over a lot of this material simply because it is a sort of a reminder of what Descartes had to say from what he had to say about the issue of epistemology, because in the attempt to answer that epistemological question of what can I know, what can we be certain about, Descartes ends up sort of stepping into these metaphysical waters, because we remember that that proclamation, that famous proclamation of Descartes, cogito ergo sum, je pense donc je suis, I think, therefore I am. What Descartes did right there was make this fundamental split between body and mind. Whenever Descartes says I think, whenever he says I am, the I that he's talking about is not a physical entity. It is a mental entity. It is an ideal entity. Because remember that Descartes says that he can doubt the existence of his body, right? You know, for all I know, I'm a brain in a vat, and I just have these electrodes that are sending signals to my brain, making me think that I have this body, making me think that I'm sitting here in this chair. But again, I could just be a brain in a vat. But beyond that, what Descartes is going to say is that I might not even have a brain at all, right? Because or be a brain, because the brain is physical, and Descartes specifically states that we can conceive of ourselves without a body. We cannot possibly conceive of ourselves without minds. So, picking up from there, and again, that's all these sort of opening pages of section 3.4 of the text. And I just want to stop here and mention, I don't have any of this stuff highlighted, but all of that stuff should look familiar to you, because that is just a different translation from what we saw earlier in the textbook. I say earlier, I mean earlier portion of the course. So if you want to, refresh your memory, go back to page 280 of the textbook. I had you read these paragraphs. And of course, notice that it's, paragraph 1 and 2 from Descartes' first meditation, which is what is reprinted here. But what I want to point out to you is that this is a different translation of the exact same material. So from the earlier unit on epistemology, paragraph 1 begins, "It is now some years since I detected how many were the false beliefs that I had from my earliest youth admitted as true, and how doubtful was everything I had since constructed on this basis." In the present section, several years now, reading from right here, several years now have elapsed since I first became aware that I had accepted, even from my youth, many false opinions for true, and that consequently what I afterward based on such principles was highly doubtful. And from that time I was convinced of the necessity of undertaking once in my life to rid myself of all the opinions I had adopted. So you see that it's the exact same text. It's just different translations of the same text. And the reason I'm emphasizing this is because McGraw-Hill, actually I take that back. I don't think this is McGraw-Hill. I think it's a Pearson text. So Pearson paid two different publishers for the rights for the exact same passage. They could have just paid for one translation of those paragraphs. They paid for two translations of those paragraphs. And guess what Pearson does? They transfer the cost of that to the consumer. And I'm emphasizing this because all these publishing companies are in bed with one another. They are purposely trying to drive the cost of textbooks up so that all those costs get passed on to the students, and then all the publishing companies end up making all of this money, which is why I don't feel bad about using a pirated version of the textbook, because textbook companies and publishers have been screwing students for years. I don't feel bad at all about using a pirated version of the textbook. So I'm going to continue to scroll down here. And now we're getting to portions of Descartes' meditations that are, after that review and sort of, just a reminder of this, how this mind-body problem comes about as a result of Descartes attempting to answer that epistemological question. Now we're going to be teasing out some metaphysical implications from Descartes' epistemological methodology. Descartes here says, I now admit nothing that is not necessary. So remember Descartes' foundational project. He is subjecting everything to a high degree of scrutiny and doubt for the purpose of finding the one thing that he cannot doubt. Again, I can doubt the existence of my body, but I can't possibly doubt the existence of my mind, because I would have to have a mind in order to form a doubt in the first place. So I can't possibly be wrong about that. But this green passage right here, but what then am I? So at the epistemological level, Descartes knows that he exists, right? It's necessary, can't possibly be otherwise. That's the epistemological level, but it brings up this metaphysical question. What is the thing that thinks? And then that opens up this ontological issue of, well, what is the nature of the thing that thinks? Descartes tells us, he says, what am I then? A thinking thing. But what is a thinking thing? This is very brief, but it's very important. It is a thing that doubts, perceives, affirms, denies, wills, refuses, that imagines also and perceives. So all those things that Descartes just mentioned, right? Affirming, denying, willing, refusing, understanding, doubting, all of that is associated with the mind, which is non-material, right? Remember this crucial step in Descartes. You can doubt material things, physical things. You cannot possibly doubt the existence of his own mind. So whenever Descartes says, well, what am I? If I'm a thinking thing, I'm a thing that doubts. The doubt doesn't come from the brain. It comes from the mind, which is non-physical, right? The understanding, which Descartes puts right there, the understanding doesn't come from the brain. It comes from the mind, which is non-physical. Denying, willing, refusing, imagining doesn't come from the physical brain. It comes from the mind, right? So Descartes is making this split between mind and brain. The brain's physical. We can imagine not having a physical body. And so if you can imagine not having a physical body, then that means you can imagine not having a brain. The brain doesn't do the thinking, according to Descartes. It's the mind that does the thinking. According to Descartes, you are just a mind that happens to have a brain. But the brain itself isn't doing the thinking. It can't be doing the thinking for Descartes. Cogito ergo sum, right? We get this word cognition from that Latin word cogito. Cogito ergo sum, I think, therefore I am. But what is the nature of the thinking thing? It's non-physical. So Descartes' metaphysical theory is called dualism. Descartes says that we are dual-natured entities. We are minds that just happen to have a body. So we have two different types of stuff. Everything else in the universe, Descartes says, is monistic, one kind of stuff. Rocks, trees, animals, even for Descartes, are monistic. They're just pure matter. Angels, God, monistic, one type of stuff, ideal stuff. Human beings, Descartes says, dual nature, two different types of stuff. We have this material stuff, this body that I walk around in, and then I have this mental, spiritual stuff that is somehow floating around inside and yet contained within my physical body. So scrolling down here, we get to what is called Descartes' conceivability argument. And I've already mentioned this. What Descartes says that I can conceive of myself having a different body entirely, right? I believe that I'm 6'3", have blue eyes and blonde hair. And why do I believe that? Well, on the basis of my experiences. But remember, Descartes' a rationalist. My experiences could be wrong, right? Maybe I'm hallucinating. Maybe I'm dreaming. Maybe I'm stuck in the matrix. Maybe I'm just a brain in a vat. Maybe I'm not actually 6'3". Maybe I'm 5'1" with brown hair and female, right? And maybe there's just some evil deceiver making me think that I have this body whenever my actual body could be different. Or again, I might not even have a body at all. So that's what Descartes is saying, is that we can conceive of ourselves with entirely different bodies, and we can conceive of ourselves without having a body at all. But I cannot conceive of myself without having thought, right? How could I, right? Because that is an act of thought. That is an act of cognition. So all of these metaphysical topics that we're dealing with right now are the result of Descartes' fundamental epistemology. What can I know? What can I doubt, right? So scrolling down here, Descartes says, I rightly conclude that my essence consists only in my being a thinking thing, or substance whose whole essence or nature is merely thinking. So two different types of substance for Descartes. Material substance, that's my body, that's my brain, and non-material substance, the cogito, that stuff of pure thought, that stuff of pure understanding, which is non-material, non-physical. It is entirely ideal. It's an ideal substance. It's not a material substance. Scrolling down here a little bit further, we get to another one of Descartes' major arguments. I already mentioned one of them, the conceivability argument. That's how he's making this distinction between mind and body. And just let me make a brief aside here to mention the difference between a course in the history of ideas versus a philosophy course. A course in the history of ideas is just emphasizing what the person said, what Descartes said. This is what he said, memorize these things. In a philosophy class, our approach is different. We want to know more than just what Descartes said. We want to know why he said it. So yes, it's important to know that Descartes made this distinction between mind and body and adopted this metaphysical theory of dualism. What we're doing in a philosophy class is sort of looking at, well, not sort of looking at, we are looking at what his argument for that was. We've already looked at one of his arguments, the conceivability argument. Again, I can conceive of myself without a body. I can't conceive of myself without a mind. How could I, right? So that's one of his arguments. Another one of his arguments is called the divisibility argument. And what Descartes is going to say is that, well, bodies, material bodies are divisible. I can take a pencil and break it in two. I can take a sheet of paper and rip it in half, right? If I take a pencil and break it in two, I now have two pencils. If I take a piece of paper and I rip it in half, I now have two pieces of paper. So bodies, because they're physical, are divisible. What Descartes is going to say is that minds, because they're non-physical, they can't be divided. So therefore, and just to read my own marginal notes here, one can divide the body, but one cannot divide the mind. Since identical things must have identical properties, Descartes concludes that mind and body are two distinct substances. So what is the claim? Dualism. We have two different types of stuff. How does Descartes go about arguing for that claim? Well, we just walked our way through two of those arguments, the conceivability argument and the divisibility argument. And as an aside, both of these arguments are highly contested, right? I'm not trying to convince you that Descartes was right. That's not what a philosophy class is about. What I'm trying to do is make sure that you understand the arguments. And if you find those arguments persuasive, fine. If you find those arguments unpersuasive, also totally fine. We don't have an agenda here. We're not trying to make you think something something is the case or something is not the case. We're just trying to introduce you to these influential theories and then let you make up your own mind as to which argument you found the most persuasive. And for reasons that we're going to be talking about in this unit. A lot of philosophers are not convinced by Descartes' arguments. And one of the reasons why a lot of philosophers aren't convinced by Descartes' arguments is because of some of these things that John Chafee, the author of your textbook, has pointed out here. Descartes again is saying that we have two different types of stuff. But the problem is, what a lot of philosophers have suggested, is that that's not really how we encounter the world, right? We encounter the world sort of unified. We encounter the world not as two things. We encounter the world as one thing. So just to read a portion of this, in our everyday experience, our minds and bodies appear to be very closely related to one another, right? What is the nature of mind and body? Descartes says that we have two different types of stuff. How do those two different types of stuff intermix with one another? It's really easy to see how material things can be contained within other material things. I have a bottle of Topo Chico here. So the physical bottle, well, the bottle is physical, right? And the water inside of it is physical. So the physical water is being contained within a physical container. We understand those types of relationships, but what Descartes is suggesting is that I have this non-material mind that is somehow floating around and contained within the physical body. So that brings up this question. It's like, well, how does my non-material mind know to stay within the confines of my physical body? What is to prevent my non-material mind from leaving my body entirely? How can a mind be embodied? And what is the relationship between them? And if my mind is non-physical, and remember what Descartes said, it's the mind that does all of the believing and the affirming and the willing and the desiring. If it's my mind that does the desiring, how does my mind know what a chalupa tastes like, right? Maybe I just got a hankering for Taco Bell. I desire to go to Taco Bell because I desire a chalupa. Well, Descartes is very specific. He tells us that that's a mental event. It's the mind that is doing the desiring, right? It's the mind that is doing the wanting. But how does my mind, which doesn't have taste buds, it doesn't have a tongue, right? It doesn't have a body, it's not physical. How does my mind know what a chalupa tastes like, to know that it's what it wants, right? So all these are really difficult questions to answer, and Descartes doesn't really give us any satisfying answers to it. Descartes sort of vaguely gestures toward the pineal gland, and he suggests that the pineal gland in the brain is what unifies mind and body. And it is a much vilified response. And the reason it's a much vilified response is because the pineal gland is itself physical. And so what Descartes is doing is pointing to a physical thing that acts as the union between something physical and non-physical, which doesn't answer the question of how something non-physical can interact with something physical, right? He's using a physical body to tell us how the non-physical can interact with the physical. He's not answering the question. He's engaged in circular reasoning. So that's why a lot of philosophers are dissatisfied with Descartes' position here. And that's why we're going to be going on to talk about other theories of mind. And so with all those things being said, I'm going to go ahead and bring this video to a close, and I'll be seeing you in the next video.